Welcome to the Test Guild Performance and Site Reliability Podcast, where we all get together to learn more about performance testing with your host, Joe Calantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Performance and Site Reliability Podcast. Today we'll be talking with Sandeep Dinesh all about performance testing iOS apps with Appium and XCode Instruments. Sandeep has over or close to 17 years of experience as a software developer in tests, build and release, and DevOps, and he's really passionate about continuous testing and writing code to make software testing more effective and efficient. Really excited to have him on the show because he's a tester, but he also does performance testing. So we're going to dive into a little bit why he thinks performance testing is important and how he incorporates it into his normal day-to-day automation testing plan. So really excited to have him on the show today. You don't want to miss this episode. Check it out. This episode is brought to you by SmartBear. Listen, load testing is tough. Investing in the right tools to automate tests, identify bottlenecks, and resolve issues quickly could save your organization time and money. SmartBear offers a suite of performance tools like Load Ninja, which is a SaaS UI load testing tool, and Load UI Pro, an API load testing tool to help teams get full visibility into UI and API performance, so you can release and recover faster than ever. Give it a shot. It's free and easy to try. Head on over to smartbear.com/solutions/performance testing to learn more. Hey, Sandeep, welcome to the Guild.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Awesome to have you on the show today. I saw a post on LinkedIn that grabbed my attention about you doing performance testing with mobile apps. Before we get into it, though, is there anything I missed in your bio that you want the Guild to know more about?
Oh, no. We are good. Okay, thanks this was like a great introduction about me. Thank you so much.
Cool. Awesome. So, Sandeep, I guess you have a lot of experience with testing in general. How did you get into performance testing? Because a lot of people sometimes completely ignore it.
I've been mainly working as a software developer in test. And most of the time, the focus of most of the companies where I was working in, they were like, okay, we want to get to this much of test coverage. We want to make sure we have a CI/CD working fine. We want to know how the software is behaving functionally, be it the backend servers or even, the clients, maybe like the browser client or maybe even the mobile clients. So I've been working in my current organization for almost like 1.5 years. We have a very small mobile app, which is both in iOS and Android. And so we have got to a point that we are reasonably stable in terms of the test automation functional coverage. And that's where we really thought, okay, hey, what's the next thing which we can do for this product? And the next thing obviously is that how best the app is performing in live systems. So, and the biggest challenge is that now that we have iOS, and people who have worked in iOS automation would know that it's really tough maybe going through things like Appium or, all these open source tools, because the platform in general is sort of, limiting you in a lot of way, not comparable to something like an ADB or all the programmer friendly APIs and tools which the Android provides. So I was working on this feature for almost 3-4 months now, and just to figure out, hey, how to get my existing automation tests to also trap the performance matrices as well. It's been a long time since I wrote something, and I really wanted to make sure, I knew for sure that this is definitely going to be useful for people. That's why I wrote this piece of, material.
Very nice. And I assume the reason why you wrote it as well is there probably wasn't a lot of information out there on how to do this. So was that one of the challenges?
Yeah, it was sort of, because we have some example in Appium Pro, but then that's actually like a Java thing. But then how we adapt it more towards what you say, maybe in the JavaScript world, or even more information about how the XCode instrument works. Those are some things which I wanted to make sure, because the current example which we have in the documentation is something like, okay, we can use some specific things like activity monitor, time profile, and things like that, which are XCode specific instruments out of the box. What I wanted to do was write something which was useful for JavaScript, as well as, we have the capability to sort of add custom profilers. Let's say for this example, I tried, and this was like a real life scenario which I wanted to do. Like in my app, I wanted to make sure that I want to check the GPU, what is the FPS, because those are the things which really matter as a performance metrics for a mobile app. So all of those things, how we can, sort of measure using a single test. So that's the reason, that was my main motivation to write more in a more sort of, detailed way.
Nice. Do you also have an Android version of the app as well?
We do. And then for Android, we probably can get these things, most of this information using ADB. Because one good thing about Android as a platform is that you can basically use the shell commands itself, maybe like a PS or top and all those sort of things. And then it's basically about getting those information in some CSV format or something like that. And then basically there is another thing for FPS specifically, the dumpsys command, which we can use for the GPU profile. And based on that, we can get the stats. So that's what I'm saying. The point is the Android is much more programmer friendly. I'm not saying whatever we have in iOS is bad. But the thing is that getting it, it's almost like Apple's ideology is like, okay, hey, this is what the customer would want. And this is actually a fabulous tool, the XCode Instruments. You get everything. The output file is literally, it has a lot of graphs. It has a lot of statistics. You can drill down further and all those sort of things. But then when it comes to sort of like a test automation requirement, like where I want to know the trend of how the software is like behaving, typically what you would do is that you run performance tests periodically, you collect the stats, and then you store the key stats somewhere, maybe, and like eventually you can retrieve that data and see how the trend is going, whether we are improving performance-wise or degrading. So those sort of things, we really want to have that sort of programming flexibility. That sort of something which is still missing in iOS, I feel. The tool is fabulous, but then it's more or less, Android gives you all the options to write the code where you want it, how you design it. But iOS is like, okay, hey, this is the API which you have, these are the format of data you will have, and you probably need to work backwards from there. Those are my personal views though.
This might be a dumb question. I'm thinking of web testing. People say, well, Chrome performs the same as Firefox. So does performance vary for the same exact app on an iOS compared to an Android? Could the performance be significantly different?
I haven't sort of, worked on specific native apps. So on both iOS and Android for comparison, we have a code base where both the platform independence is guaranteed using React Native. So the React Native by itself, it sort of takes care of how the app, even displays itself, manifests itself in both iOS and Android. And I have noticed that there are marked differences, the way the underlying API behaves. And surely it's more or less like JVM per se, when you say React Native. You basically have the same code which runs on different environments, whether it is the iOS native or the Android native. But then how does it actually translate? And that's where we were really interested, because in the past when I was working in one of my previous organizations, we had specific native clients for both the platforms, and the performance tests for them were different. And over here we have React Native. So it adds another layer of sort of, performance measurement. The level of control we have and the level of measurements we need to do are really critical in that sense.
So you mentioned a few monitors already, GPU and FPS. I don't know how many people are familiar with those terms. Maybe we could dive in a little bit more of the main monitors you look at and maybe what each one does. That would be awesome.
Sure. So GPU is the graphical processing capability of the mobile. And specifically, we want to make sure that, let's say, whether it is Android or iOS, the top frames per second, which is basically the amount of frames of animation or the app rendering, it's a measure of how the app renders itself. If there is, sometimes what happens, probably if you have played games or things like that, you see that suddenly the game slows up and, people say, okay, there is a lag, there is a drag. There is a lot of, terminology people say about the way the app displays being shown. So it's a measure of that, So it's a measure of how many frames per second we are currently showing. And the best case is 60, but then obviously human eyes don't need that. We ideally need to make sure that, we have on an average around 24 sort of frames per second. If it's more, maybe 30, 32, it's actually pretty good. So we want to make sure that, whenever we execute a particular performance scenario, you go through when you're playing a game, or maybe you are navigating from pages to pages, we want to make sure that the GPU information is captured. And XCode Instruments has a GPU measure, which you can basically add to one of your instruments. And we want to make sure that, it's not really pushed to the GPU percentages around less than 50%, that's actually pretty good. And then you want to make sure that, you have on an average around 30 frames per second.
Nice. You did mention that Appium gives you some information and Apple itself gives you some information. Do you have a report at the end? They're able to merge both of them so you get a good performance kind of overview?
No. So just to explain how Appium does this. So Appium, as you can know, it's actually something like it's a small web server which sits in between the mobile app and, the client, whichever test which you are sort of running. But in order to get to the app, it needs a driver. So for iOS, they have something called XCode UI test server. It's basically XCode UI test server. It used to be a separate project in itself, but now I think over the last couple of years, since there was no new development happening, Appium sort of has added it to one of their own open source projects. So this driver basically, what Appium runs on a set of W3C standard commands. So that gets translated into what you want to do. Let's say when you say appium.click, it actually gets translated into the driver, into the iOS code. So this driver has an integration with the XCode Instruments. So, and they have a utility. They have opened up, like in an example, I have given a couple of JavaScript commands, which says that, okay, start the performance and, stop the performance, and basically give what is the instrument which you are going to run. And then basically this format, the data format is it's like a buffer. You just need to, and it collects all this data, and then we just need to decode it to 64-bit. And then it gets translated into a zip format, which is more or less like the .trace file, which you can if you have Xcode installed on your Mac, you can basically double click on it. This file would render into itself how the app was behaving and things like that. It's more or less like, let's say if we didn't have Appium, you just wanted to profile your app. So what you do is you open the project in Xcode, and then you click on one of the top menu, you click profile. So what it does, it builds it. When you are doing this, you can choose which are the things you're going to profile. And then the app is, ready with that information. It has all those, monitors triggered and attached to it. And basically you can do your operations and then stop this activity. And then you have this information. It's basically, Appium sort of provided you that sort of an information that, okay, hey, programmatically, if you want to do this using Appium, you can do this. You don't need to, go through the Xcode method, and you just need to, it'll be like, if it's like, I don't know anything about this thing, as a tester probably, or as a test automation engineer, probably will think, okay, hey, I'll try to automate the Xcode, opening the project and things like that. You don't need to do this. You can do this like this. So that is their strategy.
Very good. I'll have a link to your blog post in the show notes because it's just 4 steps, so it seems fairly easy. I don't know. Could you talk at a high level what those 4 steps are to get someone started if they're too hard for me, or I don't know if I can do this?
Yeah, I mean that is the whole point that I really wanted them to it's that easy, because obviously we don't know much about Xcode Instruments in general, or maybe how easy it is to convert your existing test automation code into a performance test using that. In my example, it's a simple login test, which typically how you would be writing. Instead of that, I'm just saying, okay, add a couple of hooks, during whatever you want to really measure. You just need to start the performance and stop the performance once it's done. The only thing is that probably whatever template you're using for the Xcode instrument, that needs to capture whatever you want. So the first thing which you need to do is you open up the Xcode, then add a blank performance template. Add all the counters which you want. Maybe you want activity monitor, you need the GPU, you need the allocations. Allocations are for memory, the disk IO, and one crucial thing which people don't realize is the thermal state of the iOS. To be honest, Xcode really gives a lot of good features, because a lot of times you see that the mobile just heats up because when you're playing an app, or then you are using an app for a long time, all of those things can be measured. So about how you can add all those, instruments which you say together, create a template, set that aside, note down its name, and then create a small utility which would basically just call this Appium script. What is the Appium? The driver.execute script. Start the performance with this, and make sure that the PID the process ID which you are using is the current. Just that's something they have written in their code like that. If you don't pass that process ID, PID is current, what would happen is that it would do the complete fonts, data, that will be huge, which you probably are not interested. So, and then once your test is done, probably you just need to make sure that, stop the recording. And in your Appium, logs, you can actually find that this many data, this much bytes have been written. You just need to make sure that that data is captured, converted to a format which you want, and then you're good to go. It's that easy.
Very cool. So do you have separate tests just for performance, or do you instrument some of your tests that are normal functional tests and you just add extra features to capture the performance as well?
The current strategy we have is that we have some functional tests which are single user use cases, or maybe I'm not really logging into a folder or place like that where I don't have multiple data. But here, maybe it could be just if we open, maybe let's say we are trying to automate a feature like a gallery. So a functional test would be just, okay, I have just a single picture or a single video there. How quickly that gallery app opens up. That would be more or less like a functional test. But then for a performance test, I really want to make sure that, okay, maybe if there are hundreds of images there or hundreds of videos there, or if I scroll through, if I zoom through, all those sort of things. So some of the tests, like the functional tests, we definitely want to make sure that they are single user or basic things. The performance can be, it can't go on beyond that. So for those sort of things, we reuse some of the functional tests. But otherwise, it's basically we have some extra things, which probably that's a good place where where you really need to have a discussion with your app developers too. Maybe they know some part of of course, in an ideal world, we all have enough time and you have time to open and read the code which the developer has written. But of course, that's where good teams really, they help each other and say that, okay, hey, these are the performance scenarios which I can foresee. How is it good enough, or is it do you want extra or features to be tested? Or even we can say, okay, hey, this is a small code, some trick which I have done, probably I'm not so sure. The developer can themselves say that, and so the whole point is we want to try and avoid bugs rather than, okay, hey, I caught this bug, or I didn't catch that bug, that sort of a thing.
Nice. How often do you run these tests then? Is it on every check-in? Is it every quarter? How often?
The company where I'm working is very small, and we want to really push automation to the core, and we want to shift as much as possible to the left. Shift left is they really mean business there. So of course, functional tests are run almost every day. These are part of the sort of release test where we have sort of even before our product actually goes out to the market, we want to make sure that we do performance tests way ahead of cycle. But then the ideal candidate for performance tests would be more or less like a staging environment, pre-prod. We really are sure. But of course, when you write smart code, we want to make sure that we can make sure that it runs on maybe on a developed branch too. So that's the strategy we are currently taking. But ideally, it should be on a staging environment, pre-prod.
Very nice. So are there any lessons learned? Maybe you started the project and then after you're oh, I should have done this differently, or maybe I wish I knew this before I started this particular project?
That is actually sort of interesting, because when I started my career as a performance test engineer, almost way back in 2004, I was just doing load runner, and at that time, when my team asked me to do, it didn't really make much sense, how critical some of the steps which we have are, things like that, okay? So at that time, back in the day, I was doing server performance test. But out here, when I did the app performance, I forgot some of this. Of course, we are all humans. Most of the time I was doing development work and automation. So of course, I forgot some of the performance concepts. So I was doing scenarios one by one. And most of the time I was just noticing that the performance of the app was really going bad. And I was really worried, whoa, that can't be true. Then obviously I understood that each of the scenarios are sort of different. We want to make sure that, they are independent, and we want to give the best chance for the app every time you're doing the test. So that was a lesson which I learned. Basically, the next time what I did, I make sure that, the system has all the hardware capability. Maybe it could be through rebooting, reinstalling the app, making sure that the connectivity is perfect, all those sort of things. So just to make sure that, the performance data which you collect are really valid. Otherwise, if I just took this data, the dev, they probably would panic, oh, come on, it can't be that bad. So it was sort of a nice experience. And probably, it is good to learn that early rather than, give all this data, publish it to the VP, and they feel, okay, hey, the product is really bad. So we want to make sure that we are doing the right things at the right time.
Absolutely. So I guess another thing, I come from a similar background. I did mostly performance testing earlier in my career. But back then it was putting a load on a server. So you had multiple users and that was the performance, how well it did under load. When you're doing mobile testing, do you ever do concurrent users or is it always a one user type of performance test?
Yeah, I mean, it purely depends on the app. Most of the apps which we have, they don't support concurrency. Maybe Google Chrome is sort of or any browser is sort of a concurrency example where you can have multiple tabs and each tab remains as a separate process in itself. But most of the apps, if you open one, maybe the second app, they don't generally allow because they somehow feel that maybe that's not right thing to do. But yes, the major concern when we are doing performance tests for apps are basically how much memory it is consuming, how much of CPU time it's being using, how many disk writes, all sort of things, and all those sort of system I/O usage, and of course the GPU. GPU is so critical. I can't quite emphasize, because previously I was working for game testing as well, and back in the day I was doing slots testing. Slots are like, if the reels are really, they became suddenly in slow motion, the customers are going to be super, super pissed. So we really want to avoid that. So the major thing we need to worry about this are these critical features. At the same time, we want to also test some things like, when the app goes into background, how much of memory is it releasing back? Because in an ideal world, probably the app doesn't reside on its own. People have multiple apps, they're saying multiple notifications. How does the app prioritize all those sort of things? We want to make sure that customer experience is good. So that's where, like you said, it's the major difference is that, you don't have, most of the time, you don't have multiple users. I'm sure maybe the browser, maybe the testing team, they really need to worry about. They might be doing that sort of, concurrent multiple user scenarios. That will be interesting too. Maybe that's something which I will also be interested. Maybe I'll try it out. Let's see.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I'll have you back on the show for that. So do you actually test on a real device? Is it a simulator? Is it an emulator? Is it all the same? It doesn't matter what you're testing against?
Oh, no. I forgot to mention that. Thanks for reminding, Joe. So simulators are the sort of the real thing, but not the real thing. It's sort of what you say, your same, system under test as well as the test driver are the same. It's sort of like not the perfect thing. It's a good thing probably which we use for test automation because the simulator or the emulator which we have, they generally don't come in with, the real life problems of actually having a device farm or maybe a real device. As in, it doesn't do, system updates on the fly. It doesn't get a notification from other apps and things like that. And also, at least for the XCode thing, a lot of features like the GPU or even the thermal stats or things like that, they are not really, the instruments would simply fail. It says that, okay, I can't collect this because it's a simulator. But the good thing is, if you have a decent, one of the latest iOS devices using XCode Instruments, you can get most of the information which you want.
Now, this is a weird question. I've seen this a lot, but I've never asked anyone about it. You're using Concept.js. Well, what is Concept.js?
Oh, yeah. I'm not really a JavaScript expert. I mean, it's one of the framework which it's more or less like the TestNG or the PyTest or whatever we have. It has certain, good features. That's the reason our team uses this. From my observation and usage, it's more or less like a set of instructions which you can give, plus things like the automatic retrial, the skipping of certain scenarios and things like that. Those are much more, it's handled in a much more cleaner way. It has a very good integration with most of the current technologies like Puppeteer, WebDriver, Selenium, even Appium and Detox. In that sense, it's actually very good. And then the fact that our code is React Native and we are a React Native shop, it actually works very well for our technology. And of course, there are some things which I find that, because coming from Java and Python background, that, some things are tough getting it done there because it just goes in like a marching order. Okay, I see this, I see this, I see this. And if I have seen maybe step A once, it won't do the step A again. I don't know. That's why I said it has a set of orders, only that it follows that. If there is a error, if suddenly it popped up, it just fails. it just retries the same stuff, but then you can't really write a sort of in a loopy code, which of course, most of our test automation code is, we need to put a lot of bandages to make sure it works, because, at the end of the day, maybe if a login fails, we can't just stop there. We try to make sure that we get the best chance for the code to go forward. But in that sense, concept is very strict. But of course, that's another way of looking at it is saying that, okay, hey, if you have a bug there, what's the point in going further, right? So it's like that.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, Sandeep, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give to someone to help them with their iOS performance testing efforts or strategies? And what's the best way to find or contact you?
Sure. So definitely, if you are sort of using maybe Appium or any technology, try to use this. There are other methods too by which we can get the same thing done, because I was exploring further, and recently I was working more on the web view automation, because what happens is that, you might not get that sort of performance matrices from the app process sometimes. Sometimes it gets delegated to the app web view, the Apple web view which you have. So specifically that process needs to be instrumented and found out. That would definitely be a separate process. I would say a separate blog in itself. Maybe currently I'm working on it. I can't really share much details because I'm still learning, and probably whatever I have shared with my developers, they're quite happy with what they have seen. It's basically you need to use at that point of time maybe the Xcode command line by itself. Of course, in iOS, I would say it has lesser flexibility. Let's say using ADB, let's say you can say ADB top command and then collect the stats. But then they still have some information are not really exposed or maybe advertised that well. But then they still have some things like Xcode Xcode trace, by which you can achieve the same thing. And you probably can automate, and you can attach. It's actually very neat as well. You give the process name, not really the process ID. You can give either of it and attach itself, and it will still run on the same, instruments. So that's something which I would say probably don't lose hope and probably just try to do this manually. Listen to podcasts and talk to people. I would say ask these questions in web forums and things like that. Maybe that will definitely help, because I for sure learned a lot from some of the other bloggers or people who actually worked on this. And that's why most of us are really happy to share this information. And I know that this information is less, but then maybe try to ask that question and maybe seek help. Probably maybe I can also learn a lot of new things. Similarly, a lot of people would be able to share that information.
Awesome. Sandeep, the best way to find or contact you?
Sure. My LinkedIn or my Medium and my email address. Please, I have shared that information out there and open. And a lot of people actually directly talk to me as well. Maybe I did a lot of GitHub Action integration for iOS simulators and Android emulators. They did reach out to me, and I'll try my best to help, or at least point them in the right direction so that they try to solve that issue.
Thanks again for your performance testing awesomeness. For links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/P67. And while you're there, make sure to click on the Try Them Both Today link under the exclusive sponsors section to learn all about SmartBear's two awesome performance test tool solutions, Load Ninja and Load UI Pro. And if the show has helped you in any way, why not rate and review it in iTunes? Reviews really do matter in the rankings of the show, and I read each and every one of them. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Performance and Site Reliability Podcast. I'm Joe. My mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack performance testing awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Performance and Site Reliability Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Don't forget to subscribe to the Guild to continue your testing journey.